Welcome back. In a moment, we'll hear claims of war crimes in Iraq. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. Donald Trump's revised travel ban will take at least another week to put into action. The new order has been described as tighter and more streamlined after the first sparked widespread confusion and outrage. Protesters staging a year-long demonstration against the proposed Dakota Access Pipeline have been forced to leave the site following an executive order from the Trump administration. Many demonstrators set fires as they left, and some who ignored instructions to depart were arrested. North Korea has condemned an investigation into the death of Kim Jong-un's half-brother, who was murdered in Malaysia. The North Korean government has accused Malaysia of trying to politicize the return of his body. Well, back now to the fight against Daesh in Iraq, and fears that those leading the fight against the terror group are also committing atrocities. In addition to the official Iraqi army, much of the fighting is carried out by militia groups, which have tacit backing from Baghdad. In 2014, the Iraqi government established the Popular Mobilization Units, where volunteer fighters joined existing and new Shia militia groups. The groups consist of an estimated 140,000 men operating in between 40 and 50 separate units who are supplied with weapons and money. Amnesty International accused the groups of carrying out war crimes, including kidnappings, torture and unlawful killings. Well, with me in the studio now is Donatella Rovera from Amnesty International. Of all the confusion as to who's fighting whom in Iraq, you paint a particularly interesting picture because the Iraqi army is not one thing, it's not one unit, is it?
Well, the Iraqi army is not much of anything at the moment because the Iraqi army practically disintegrated in June 2014 when ISIS took over much of the country and it hasn't really managed to rebuild itself up at all. There is only one small part of the Iraqi forces, which is the elite special forces, the counter-terrorism forces, that have been since trained and built up and have sort of garnered some success in recent operation. But otherwise, for the most part, the army has not been all that relevant.
But it's been augmented by these sort of freelance groups who are taking the fight to Daesh, yeah?
Instead of the army being put back together, free rein has been given to a very large number, more than 40 militias, some of which have existed since the 80s, many others who have come about during the sectarian war of 2006-07, and then more recently to an unprecedented level since June 2014. We have seen the Shia militias gain an unprecedented power, recognition, resources. So they are really the ones who've been running the show when it's come to taking territory back from ISIS, but also what some would define as kind of maintaining security in the country. Others would call it stoking, sectarian tensions.
But they have the support of the Iraqi government to the point that arms and equipment and kit, even to the size of tanks, we understand, are basically just handed over to these groups.
Absolutely. They have been receiving from day one support in many different ways, in terms of salaries or other sort of funds paid to them, weapons, and the freedom to operate as they want. So we've seen a large amount of weapons that had been transferred to the Iraqi government for the use by the Iraqi army and security forces, passing into the hands of these various militias, even long before they had been recognized as being part of the regular forces, which they are now only nominally. The term PMU, Popular Mobilization Unit, or PMF, Popular Mobilization Forces, it's only a brand. The reality is that there are more than 40 separate militias, each with its own chief and its own objectives, operating throughout the country.
And I know it's difficult to talk about conventional warfare in the context of Iraq with its decades of chaos there and disruption. But when an arms company from Europe, America or whatever sells arms to a government, they do so obviously for profit, but they do so normally expecting codes of behaviour, of accepted codes of warfare, if you like, will be adhered to. Now, by immediately then handing over arms and equipment and resources like money to these groups, the Iraqi government don't know what is being done in their name now, do they?
The Iraqi government has not put in place any sort of oversight mechanism to ensure that the conduct of their forces, let alone these militias, complies with international law. They also don't have the mechanisms in place to have a proper tracking of the weapons, who uses them, where they go. And so that makes it, even more difficult to have any sort of idea as what the weapons are being used for. And the countries that have been donating or selling or otherwise transferring weapons and military equipment to the Iraqi government, to the Iraqi forces, know this very, very well. I mean, the American and the Brits, and the American and the British forces were in Iraq, and they were at the receiving end of repeated attacks by these very same militias who are today benefiting from the weapons that these countries are selling to Iraq.
Now, you've been there and seen the effects of this. The argument might be, well, Daesh is sinking to the lowest standards of human behavior, of all sorts of torture, burning people alive, whatever it might be. So we need to fight that kind of terror with that kind of terror. And that is why I don't think there's a moral equivalence here, but there's perhaps some kind of military equivalence here. Does that argument hold up, do you think?
It doesn't. First of all, because such practices are never acceptable. They are criminal practices which are condemned unequivocally by the entire world, and there is no reason why they should be accepted if those who carry them out are Iraqi militias who are on the side of the government.
Yeah.
Secondly, the people who are at the receiving end of these brutal attacks, extrajudicial execution, massacres, torture, disappearances, there are thousands of men who've been taken and nothing has been heard of them for years. They are often not the people who are responsible for committing the atrocities on behalf of ISIS. Obviously anyone who's committed any crimes on behalf of ISIS or anybody else should be detained and put through the justice system. There is a justice system in Iraq. There are prisons. People can be brought to trial instead of, walking into a village and massacring the entire
You mentioned about the
population.
Iraqi prisons. I mean, we got an insight, didn't we, only recently, that they are not working as well as they should either, are they? They're not safe places.
They're not safe places. The justice system is intrinsically dysfunctional. And once again, because the Iraqi government and the Iraqi authorities, instead of prioritizing the sort of forces that are performing well but are accountable, and the justice system that holds accountable anyone who commits crimes, whether it be ISIS or their own forces, it has allowed chaos to prevail, and the rise to power to an unprecedented level of these militias has largely been part of it. I mean, we've seen some of these militias openly challenging parts of the government as well.
So it is the most literal form of chaos. It is. Yeah. Nobody knows what's going on. And one has to worry, sometimes in conflict, you look to the next generation, you look to the young people and hope that they might be able to build a better world. But I know that you've met some youngsters in your travels in Iraq, particularly around the Mosul area, and these are damaged young people, aren't they? Teenage boys who've seen the most awful things.
Absolutely. Just at the end of December, I spent some time in the areas around Mosul in the north, and focused particularly on the plight of the children. Children killed, children injured, and children who are incredibly traumatized because they have been made to witness executions, amputations, beheading. Some of them were made themselves to carry out these atrocities. They come back to their families, and there is no real support for them, no psychosocial treatment. And so it certainly makes one wonder how these children, because they are children, some of them are only like 8 or 9 years old, and they have participated in beheading by force and witnessed them. What this is going to do to them, how will they process so much brutality, and how's that going to come out? And that will certainly have a bearing on how they will fit and contribute to society.
Donatella Rovera, thank you very much indeed for talking to us today.
Thank you.
We end with our Insight Bite. This is a little something that we feel you should know. In Mexico, there's no shortage of criticism for the US President Donald Trump. But at a festival in Veracruz, celebrators found a new way of voicing their disapproval by burning a model of President Trump's proposed border wall in a public square. Since the beginning of Mr. Trump's campaign, he's promised to build a great wall along the country's southern border and to force Mexico to pay for it. It's an incendiary policy in Mexico, where many millions of their countrymen and women are living and working in the US. I suppose this is just one way of putting some heat on the Trump administration. And that's all from me for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.